for the University of Delaware. This is Mariana Williams. And I'm just going to walk you through some of the things that we covered in class on Monday. So I'm still using 3ds Max 2016, working on the licensing for 2018, so bear with me there. But the principles are the same, and you should be able to do the same things we're doing here today within the 2018 version. So I'm just going to go by getting into my original setup. Okay, it brings me into the perspective window, and today's tutorial might be a little bit condensed compared to the lesson in class, but we're basically going to go over how to modify our geometry a little bit more using the Edit Poly modifier. We're going to go into the Modify tab, look at pivots a little bit, figure out how to adjust that gizmo and that pivot so that you can have more control when you're rotating your objects and scaling them and moving them. And we're also going to go into the difference between copies and instances of objects so that you can create changes across geometries all at once for groups of instances, or you can create copies of one geometry and then work with those as independent units as copies. So a couple of things we're going to get into. We may also look into noise and how to add the noise modifier to planes to create some sort of rippling effect. That noise modifier also works on other types of geometry, so I encourage you to experiment with that. But for now, I'm just going to get in, and I'm just going to start by going to my Create menu, to Standard Primitives, and I'm going to select Plane. I'm just going to start by clicking and dragging into my space to create a plane. Actually, because this is a new demo and a new file, first things first, just good practice to get in, I want to get into my project folder. In the 2018 version, it's simply File, Set Project Folder, but I'm still in 2016, so I'm just going to set the project folder. I'm actually going to set this on my external drive. I'll set it on the desktop, why not? I'm going to make a new folder on the desktop called 3ds Edit Poly Demo. And I'm just going to set OK. If I actually go back into my desktop now, I can see that this folder I just created in Max is now on my desktop. So it's a great sign. That's exactly what I want. If I click in that, 3ds Max has automatically established a render output folder. That's where all of my render files are going to go once I'm finished animating using the timeline. I've got a scenes folder. Right now it's currently empty. I need to save that scene, so I'll just go back in here to Max, and I'm just going to save this scene as it's already, see, this is the file path to my scenes. I'm going to name this as 3ds demo from September 11th, because that was the date of class, 2017. I'm just going to hit save. Now if I go back into my folder, you see that file I just saved is right there in the saved scenes. So looks like we're good to go. We're safe as far as what we're doing. So just a quick review. Last week we went into the auto keyframe. You select this auto button, and then this red window appears within our workspace. And that just indicates that you are actually, any change you make to the scene, any change you move, if you move a camera, if you move a plane, any sort of modification you do from this point forward will change everything that's on keyframe 0. If you move this scroll bar up and change something else, let's say we add a box here, hit Q to deselect, and then actually hit play, you see that the box is there, okay, but let's say I move from frame 0, the box is here, and let's say I move up to frame 30, use my W key to move the box over here, get back and deselect, and I just hit play one more time, see what happens. So the auto keyframe has remembered the motion from frame 0 to frame 33, and it's moved set amount of units between those frames. So, to turn that off, let's say I'm finished keyframing, that's my animation. I can just continue to select that auto keyframe, and then if I hit play again, that animation is still there, it still exists. So just a quick review of animation. If I didn't want that motion, or if I have too much going on and I need to say delete some keyframes, I can just highlight them just by clicking on them in the timeline, or by dragging the cursor over them and hit the delete key, and now that motion's no longer there. So pretty interesting stuff, pretty good. Before we move forward, I just want to show you something, another way to keyframe. This is by setting a manual keyframe. So I have my box selected here. You can see it in my Scene Explorer, the box and the plane. And I'm just gonna select this set key. Now you see that the window still turns red, just like in the auto keyframe. But if I actually move the cursor up to 33, where it's been auto keyframed, and then I move it again to, let's say, frame 60, and I hit my W keys and I move it. Oops, I've got both selected. I only want the box, just this box here. Let's say I move it in the Y direction over to this side of my plane, and I hit play just to show you what will happen if I don't. Because I'm on manual keyframe, nothing actually happens. That movement is not remembered. I actually have to set that on my own. So I'm just going to show you how to do that. So the auto keyframe has got me up to this point, frame 38. And going over to frame 66, same sort of thing. Move it over here. The only difference between a manual keyframe and an auto keyframe is that you actually have to hit this set keys button. And when I do that, it's created a manual keyframe right here at frame 66. So now, when I hit play, I have the auto keyframe and that manual keyframe both working. Let's say that's good for me, and I'm finished animating that keyframe manually. So I'm just going to select set keyframe again, and that turns my animation dialog off. If I review this and I say, okay, well, this L shape, that's not really what I was going for. Maybe I intended to create more of a diagonal motion for that box. I can actually delete that keyframe, just like I mentioned earlier. So I'm just going to go in, select frame 33, delete that motion, hitting the delete key. And if I just play that animation, you see that it's changed the motion of that box, simply by deleting that keyframe. If I change my mind at any point and say, actually, the L motion is what I wanted, I didn't want a diagonal, I can just hit Control Z. That keyframe reappears, so Control Z as undo, Control Y to redo, so to redelete, but I'll say Control Z. And if I play again, I've got that L motion one more time. So a little bit about keyframing, basic animation principles, just setting that motion up. Either way is valid, both are great options. We're going to get a little bit more into keyframe interpolation a little bit later to change the rate of motion, like, slow in and fast out, or fast in, slow out, as far as if you've got something that you need to move at a different rate of time. But for now, work with whichever you're more comfortable with. Just make sure if you're not trying to edit things or construct your scene with the auto keyframe on, that you don't have that those keyframes going, because you don't. Sometimes you forget that it's there, and you suddenly see your scene being built in front of you. So as you play it back to see your motion, so just a little thing to be careful about. Just as good practice. I'm going to save my scene again, and then let's move on to a little bit more like with copies and instances and changing the geometry of this box. So I'm actually toggling around the screen using my middle scroll wheel and the Alt key. That's just giving me this sort of ball scroll motion. If I hit Q, I'm back into the standard object select mode. And if I actually hold that middle scroll wheel down and drag my mouse back and forth, I can pan back and forth within my scene. Zooming in also zooms in on the box. So, got that. Just want to go into a little bit about this box itself and just show you a little bit how construction principles are working in 3ds Max. So you know that we can create any set of shapes, standard primitives, extended primitives, by going to this drop down in the create menu. So you want to create an L extension. I can click within my scene, click up, and then actually draw in by moving my mouse around in different directions. I can create different geometries. An extended primitive are these primitives that work the same way as a standard primitive, but they take more than one mouse click to create. When I create something, so I'll select Q, select this box. If I look at, I'm just clicking here in my viewport in a wireframe mode, just to see what the geometry is more like. So if you're working in 2018 and you don't see the edged faces, you can go to display selected with edged faces. I'll show you a little bit more about that. So I'm just going to go into the Modify tab. So I've got the Create tab to create the geometry to insert it into the scene. And then I have the Modify tab. And this gives me the box itself. I can rename it. You can see a box over here. So this is my box. You see my box has now changed names over here. You can also rename objects by right-clicking and then hitting Rename in this dialog. So let's say box 1. And that should change. Well, it doesn't change back this way, but it does change from one to the other. I can actually, these are the parameters of the box. It's 18 units in length. You can round that out at 18 if I wanted to. Hit Command Z to undo that. By 10, by say 20, right? That's my box. And you see that it has one length segment, one width segment, and one height segment. So I want to give this a little bit more detail so that I can start to transform this box into something else. You don't want to start with too much detail. I mean, I don't need necessarily 100 link segments, but maybe 2 or 3 gives me a little bit more control, and I can start to work with a more block-like geometry. And then as I find something and find a form that I like, continue to refine that in steps, working from a large scale detail to a very detailed smaller scale edit. So let me just show you a little bit what I mean by that. Link segments, let's just change that to 2. Change the width to 2 and the height to 2. So you see, I'm starting to see my box being divided into different smaller boxes. This actually doesn't change the shape of the box, it just gives me more coordinates and more vertices through which I can edit this geometry. Okay? So if you don't see this grid here, you can go into you can see a shaded view. The shaded view, you want to go to display selected, and you want to display the selected with edged faces, and that's going to allow you to see that grid. See right now I don't have that selected, and even though my link segments, width segments, and height segments have changed, I'm not able to really see those vertices. So just to be able to do that, I'm going to go to display selected, display those with the edged faces. And now when I select that box, I'm good to go. So let's say height-wise, maybe 3 is better. And maybe, let's say width-wise, I want to try 3. Nah, maybe 2. And maybe length, we'll try 3. Maybe. There we go. So that's more something I want to work with, right? So I'm in the Modify tab, and I have these length and width segments, but how do I actually change these vertices? Well, I can go down to this modifier list, and it's got all types of things that I can do to this box. I definitely encourage you to explore this on your own. Definitely check it out. But for now, we're just going to do Edit Poly, just right here. You can simply click on this to add that modifier to the box, or you can start typing in the first couple letters of any of these modifiers, and it will take you straight to them. So I've typed in ED on my keyboard, and it's brought me up to Edit Poly. We don't want Edit Mesh, we don't want Edit Normals, we don't want Edit Patch. For now, let's just stick with Edit Poly. So I've got Edit Poly right here, and you see that I now I can select these vertices, I can select the edges, the borders. It gives me constraints of the box, different things that I can edit in this geometry. I can always get back to my box, those original parameters that we were working with, by just clicking on the box, or I can get into Edit Poly again if I ever say have to deselect it by clicking Edit Poly one more time. Okay, so I'm just going to select the vertices. You notice when I select this vertices with all the vertexes, this little yellow box has appeared. That means that's active. If I click this again, it's no longer active, and my box is more just a stable unit. So it's good to be aware of. You click once to activate it, and then from there you can select them individually and use those same move, rotate, and scale, the W, E, and R keys to change that geometry. So I've just hit the W key for move, and I'm moving this vertex outward. Just hit Command Z to undo that. Let's say, what should we make this into? I'll just show you, you can select a number of them. If you select this one vertex, then you hold Shift and you double click, you should be able to select all of the vertices around the entire object. And if I hit something like the scale key, R, I can scale those uniformly in, or hit Q again to deselect, select this top vertices, and I'm just going to click the one right next to it, hold Shift and double click. If that doesn't work, you can also hit Control and select multiple vertices at one time. Same with edged faces, edges, faces, any of that. And I can again hit the R key and scale this in a bit, or hit Command Z, get out of that. The W key, I can bring that down a bit. I can select them individually and hold Control and select this one right here on the outside. And I can actually scale those in the Y direction in. So, you can do a number of things with these. So let's say this is a geometry I'm decently fine with. I'm not sure quite what that is. But say I'm finished, or say I want to edit just the faces here. I can select just this face and actually draw that up with my W key. Create any sort of geometry. Hit Q to get out of that. Finish with that. I just deselect that polygon face and deselect out of that, and it shows me this is my original box, but with Edit Poly. So as long as you can think of, you can really create anything from very simple shapes. You just have to think about what other shapes are used to build that more complicated shape, which is why it's useful to sometimes work in sort of a more rigid, blocky sort of geometry, and then go in and try to refine that detail. Just always saves you a little bit of time, good for your workflow. Okay, awesome. So I've got this box here. If I go into my perspective view, let's say I like this. Let's find an angle that we like. Just dragging in. see, this is pretty decent. I like this view, and I want to go back to it, but I need to sort of explain some more things about copies and instances, and maybe we want to start playing with some noise modifiers in 3ds. So, you know, just to save this view, I always like to use something called create camera from view. So I'm actually going to go in and create a camera. I'm creating a physical camera from the view, or Control-C. I'm just going to click on that. It's exactly the same in 3ds Max 2018. And you see that when I clicked that, it's created something called the physical camera 1. You can always see it here in my Scene Explorer. And every physical camera, unlike a free camera, has a target. So you can imagine if you were standing outside with a SLR camera or with your iPhone, something like that, and there is a laser beam that was extending from your camera to the object that you're focusing on, the end point of that laser would be the target for your camera. And that's pretty useful because we can animate the camera just like we animate and move other objects and geometries within the scene, and we can animate where that target is. So just gives you a little bit more control, and we can go further into that in the next lesson. So I've got that saved. I'm going to hit the hotkey for perspective. That shows me this is the range of vision for my physical camera. If I click once, I can get out of that. And you see, just looking around, this is my physical camera target, and this is my physical camera. So this is that laser beam I was talking about. It's not really a laser beam, but you get the gist. So I could, let's say, you know, hit the W key and move this target up. Now when I go into C for camera view, you see, oh my gosh, it's way up there. Or I can move it, you know, down quite far. I could also go in and keyframe that. So I'm just gonna drag my Scene Explorer. I'm working in physical camera 1. I'm hitting my auto keyframe. Let's say I'm on frame 0. And let's see. So to get to any keyframe, what I've just done is I've moved this toggle window back to 0. This little scroll bar says 0 of 100. And that's pretty good. It's right there on frame 0. And I want it by frame 100. I want my camera to change. So I'm actually not going to work in the camera view to change that. I know that I'm changing the camera's target and moving that upwards, but I'm just going to change that in the perspective window with the keyframe on because I don't want to change my zoom as far as the camera goes. I only want it to tilt upwards. So just quickly, I was in camera view. I have my target selected. I also have hit the W key with the target selected so that I can move that camera target. But before I do that, I just want to switch quickly back into perspective because that way I can scroll out and it won't necessarily affect it. So I've got my last frame is 100, 100, and I'm going to select the camera target again here and actually move it up slightly on the Z direction. Now I can hit C again. See, okay, that's where it is. And maybe I can adjust it in camera view just slightly, right? So it stops maybe like, that's too much. But maybe you're right here, that's where I want it to stop. Okay? And then if I hit Q again, turn this auto keyframe off so nothing changes again. I can see that I have a frame on frame 100 and on frame 0. And I'm just gonna play that back and show you a little bit what happened. So I've got that camera motion as well. A little bit of an issue because you see this is passing through my L. It's not working for me. So I'm just gonna I've still got the physical camera, the target here selected. So it's showing me the keyframes for just my camera. If I select the box, it shows me only the keyframes for the box. so to delete maybe that camera tilt, I'm just going to select my physical camera again. Actually delete that last frame. So I just hit delete with frame 100 selected. And when I do that, if I play my animation back through again, you see the camera doesn't move. I've actually deleted that frame. So just little animation tricks, little things we can do. I'm in perspective view right now. You can see that within my scene, within my window, workspace. So I'm just going to show you a little bit about making copies and instances of objects. So why don't we take this L bracket here and move it over. And let's also maybe use the E key and rotate this guy. Rotate it, move it up a bit. Okay, so we've got this sort of like a pillar-like object going on in the scene. And if I select it and then hit the W key, the move key again, you can see that I'm actually moving this object from this top right corner. If I for any reason wasn't too happy with that, if I say wanted to move it from the center of this object, I can move that pivot point. So quickly, it's pivoting from this top corner right here. But let's say, and that's indicated by this red line where these the Z, X, and Y intersect. But I can also go into another tab. So I've got Create, Modify, and Hierarchy. And I'm working with this pivot point within this object, right? So I can affect the pivot only, and I can actually center that pivot to the object. This is the Alignment tab for that. I can reset it, set it back to where it started. I can align the pivot to the object or to the world. That's sometimes helpful if you're rotating something and you rotate something so far that you have a hard time moving it within world space. I can align it back to the object, center it down, or I can manually move that pivot using the W tool again. So I could move it up and down to any point. That's really useful when you're trying to, say you want to animate a bell or something that's turning, or you need something that's swinging in a certain direction, or you're rigging something for a character. Really useful to be able to change that pivot point and also to be able to reset that. And we're going to go into that more as the course progresses, so don't fret too much if you're not totally confident on this part of it right now. For now, I'm just going to reset the pivot and select Affect Pivot Only to get back to my normal move with the W key, just like the one we're used to. If I did, just to review, if I did want to move this object from the center of the object, I could say Affect Pivot Only, Center to Object, select Affect Pivot Only again to get out of that dialog, and then I'm working on a normal way with that move tool. So back in the Modify tab here, back in World Space, I'm just going to create a copy of this object. So with W, the hotkey, with the Move tool selected and the object selected, this L extension, or I can right click and rename as my L master. I'm hovering over this X-axis. I can hold Shift and actually drag, and that Shift and drag will give me this Clone Options dialog. So for this, I have choices. For now, we're only going to worry about copies and instances. A copy is creating an object that's independent in its own right. It's an exact replica, but it has its own parameters. If you do something to the copy, the original will be unchanged. Okay, so let's do that first. So I've got this copy here, and looking at that, let's say I'm going to add edit poly to this copy, and I'm actually gonna look at the L extension and see, okay, I don't have that many segments. I got to that by clicking on L extension. I got to that, let's say I only have, I don't know, say I want 10 width segments. It's way too much. You see they just appeared right here. It's way too much. Maybe 1 is fine, or maybe 2. That's even too much for now. 1 is fine. The front steps, let's test that out. That's also way too much. Let's just stick with 1. Side segments, 10. Okay, that's more doable. Let's just work with that for now. Going back into Edit Poly, selecting some vertices, or I could select just the polygon faces, and I just hold Shift. I shift and clicked next to the first one, and I'm actually scaling. That's not good. Maybe I'll just move a face out. How about that? See, the L extension is working a little bit different than the standard box as far as completing the geometry, and it's because the extended primitives have a little bit different parameters than a standard primitive in a box. But for now, don't worry too much about it. But you see that my original is pretty much unchanged. You know, you can get out of that. So I've got this sort of extended primitive and this original, and that's because this is a copy. If I were to take this original, same thing, select the W key for move, hold Shift, and drag. And this time I'm selecting an instance. Let's say I want to make, I don't know, 4 of these guys. And I just hit OK. It's created actually 4 instance clones of this original master object. And you see that the distance at which I copied the object also creates a uniform interval between each of the other instance copies. So, for example, if I hit Command Z and I hit Shift, just a small distance, get the clone dialog, make an instance of 4, and hit OK. It's actually created a much smaller distance between those objects. So, just something to be aware of, that you do actually have control over how things are arrayed across the screen. So, just good to know. Just little details. Okay, so I just want to show you now a little bit how those instance copies, how affecting one of these guys is also going to affect every single one of those. So I'm in the L extension dialog here, and I see that, alright, I've got a height of 7.52. What if I make it a height of 15? I can select any number of those, and it actually changes all of them all at once. I could also say, the width, I want it to be 2. Now they're all changed. Side width of, say, 5. Okay, they've changed there too. Maybe that's a little bit too much, right? You can just click and deselect. So an instance is really great as a way of cloning an object when you want to create a series of things where everything is being changed across the board within a group. If you want to, copies are useful for making individual items or individual geometries that you want to be iterative of each other, but which ultimately need their own parameters, or which need their own textures, or they're individual. It's like having everyone's a person, but we all have different characteristics. We're not all a clone army, so to speak. So kind of useful there. If we have any more questions about copies and instances, feel free to reach out to me, and we can set up a time and walk it through together. So the final thing I want to cover in this demo is animating noise. And we're going to do that for the plane underneath here. You can do this with a lot of different geometries. I honestly encourage you to experiment with things. Try to find the limits of the program. Try to find where things stop working within the program. Because it shows you how to better troubleshoot things. It'll make you better understand the program, and it'll help you when you start to build your own tools. Say we start scripting something, you know, okay, well, this works for this and not for that, so maybe we'll go with that. So just to animate that noise one last time, I'm just gonna select this plane. And, you know, actually, I think I'm going to scale it a little bit more. So I'm hitting the R key to scale, and I'm just going to pull out in the X direction. And hit Q again to deselect. And if I'm in the Modify tab right now, so I'm able to see the parameters of this, this plane that I've created. I'm going to just round those out a little bit to make it a little bit easier for me. It's for scaling and for animating that noise. So I'm changing the length to 150, the width to 140, and instead of 4x4 length and width segments you see right here, I'm actually gonna make this say 40 by 40. And unlike building geometry, animating noise across a plane, I actually do want a lot of length and width segments because it's going to allow me to further manipulate that object, and the noise will show up a little bit better. So I'm happy with that. If we need to adjust this, if the noise doesn't appear properly, you might have to adjust these coordinates. You might need to add, say, 400 by 400. But for now, 40 by 40 is totally fine. Okay, so I've got the amount of segments we're going to test out, 40 by 40, maybe this 150 by 140, see how it goes, right? So I'm going to go back into my modifier list, and I've actually got, if I just type in for noise, I've got noise, and I hit enter to select that, and so I have my plane, and I have the noise modifier. I'm just selecting those and clicking on them. So what I'm going to do is I'm not actually going to change the X and the Y very much. If I change those, it's not going to do too much for my object. I mainly want to work on the Z direction and create like a wave-like motion for now. We'll get into further water and noise and other modifiers for this, so probably you'll get a little bit more comfortable with it as we go on. But for now, let's just work on the Z-axis, and let's change some of these parameters to create sort of a rippling effect across this plane, so that it's not just a static plane. So I'm adding noise along the Z-axis simply by dragging up a bit. I'm actually going to click Animate Noise. So let's see, maybe I'll set the Z to test something out to 2. And if I just, let's see, make sure this fractal is off. If you want it on, you can have it on. It just creates a different type of motion. The frequency is going to be, how often, how intense that noise is animated. And then the phase is really talking about your keyframes a little bit. But we have 100 keyframes. We're currently at, 94th phase of this. I'm just going to, I have the animate noise checked. I'm just going to play the animation. You see that my plane starts to ripple a little bit. If I increase the strength of this, it ripples a ton. And so the reason why we had a lot of vertices in this plane is because it's giving us more points through which we can animate noise and create movement. If we have fewer points, there's fewer points to move up and down. So having a lot of points gives us a different effect, gives us a little bit more control. I can hit auto keyframe and actually keyframe that. And if I render that, it's going to come out with a moving plane. So pretty handy little trick. Just hit the pause button again. The seed and The scale that has to do with the seed is the variation. Think of it like a plant. Like there's a ton of different types of tomatoes. They're all tomatoes, but they're all just a little bit different. So yeah, I definitely like encourage you to play around with that. I'll just zoom out a little bit and show. Hit play one more time. You see that plane is moving. Pretty useful to think about creating some more environmental effects. So that's basically a review of what we've done in class from yesterday. And I'm looking forward to introducing some more things for y'all tomorrow. Work with some lighting and a little bit more with the render dialogue. So yeah, have a great night, and I will see you soon. Thanks.